Today we're going to be going over a basic introduction to Chinese Buddhism. So previously we've covered kind of Buddhism basics, we've covered the Mahayana, we've covered Japanese Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, dug a little more deeply into the Shin Pure Land tradition. And today we're taking another step back to look at one of these broader, we might call it Chinese Buddhism. We could also call this East Asian Buddhism because China in Chinese is called Zhongguo, or the Middle Kingdom. And that can include, and that basically means that, the Middle Kingdom, like the center of the world. And if you were in East Asia, China was the center of the world. So let's dig into some of the let's say common or shared features that we find within Chinese Buddhism. Mm-hmm. One of these important issues that often was confusing to early scholars of Chinese Buddhism is the importance of family and ancestors. Early scholars of Buddhism writing in European languages did not have a lot in the way of cultural context for Buddhism, because they're trying to discover Buddhism in the ancient Indian texts, but Buddhism was basically gone from India. So what they had for examples of living Buddhism was often in China. And they didn't understand how family could be so important to a tradition that seems to be about renunciation, right? The life story of the Buddha is, there's this initial renunciation. So these early scholars thought that families and ancestors, family-focused practice and ancestor worship and whatnot, they thought that this was a feature of Chinese Buddhism, or a sign of sinification, or sinicization, of becoming Chinese. But actually, more recent archaeological evidence has revealed that, in fact, Buddhist monks were taking care of their families, their parents, and so on, long ago in India. More recently, I've seen Buddhist philosophers in East Asia emphasize the idea that, recognizing your debt to your parents and to your family and your ancestors is a form of, is a way of putting the concept of no self in practice. I am because others are. I am because of the contributions and help I've received from my family and my community and so on. Seeing ourselves as well as dependently arisen in context, in family, and so on. So Buddhism as a family practice can also be, in a very profound way, kind of bringing to life some of these more abstract doctrinal concepts as well. One of the other common features that we find in East Asia is aspiration for rebirth in the Pure Land of the Buddha Amitabha, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. As well as a recitation of the phrase Namo Omi Tofo, also called the Nianfo in Chinese. The word Nianfo means Buddha mindfulness, but often is basically synonymous with the recitation of the name of the Buddha Amitabha. You even sometimes meet people who have these little recordings, these little boxes where you push a button and it just sings Namo Omi Tofo over and over in this beautiful melodic style. And so sometimes you might meet people, and when they greet you, especially in Buddhist context, they may greet you with Ami Tofo, Ami Tofo. I've even seen cases where that's the sign off on the email. Instead of best or sincerely, it's Ami Tofo. I think that's kind of interesting. Devotion to the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, pictured here in her kind of compassionate mother form, is another common object of devotion in addition to the Buddha Amitabha. One might, in addition to Namo Omi Tofo, one might say Namo Guanyin Pusa or Namo Guan Shiyin Pusa. The Chinese name for Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, is Guanyin. Very popular object of devotion in China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and elsewhere. One of the other important practices is the recitation of the Great Compassion Dharani. Dharani is kind of like a mantra, but much longer. The Great Compassion Dharani is about a page long, and if you spend time in East Asian Buddhist context, you're likely to encounter this chant. Okay, so, but we have the Great Compassion Dharani. The Great Compassion Dharani is it's like a mantra, but much longer. A dadani is another kind of incantation or thing that that is said and repeated and chanted. Um, in addition to these things, we also have the centrality of Chan or Zen Buddhism. Chan or Zen, in an English speaking context, probably the word Zen is maybe more familiar, but Chan is the kind of parent tradition that really becomes kind of the dominant system in China, Korea, and Vietnam. By the Song dynasty, state temples in China are run by abbots who have an affiliation with the Chan lineage, and it becomes kind of the default identifier. But sometimes we think about these different schools of Buddhism as if like this is all they're able to do. Or the Chan or Zen Buddhists, they just meditate, but it's not like that at all. It's more like this is your starting point from which you're able to then use all of these other practices and teachings. So with Zen, we have a lot of emphasis on meditation, to be sure, but also literature and poetry and philosophy and so on. The highly literate tradition. The kind of might say the founding myth of the Chan tradition is that once Shakyamuni Buddha was giving a lecture and he held up a flower, and the audience was kind of confused because he's just holding up this flower. And then one of the people in the audience, Mahakashyapa, saw the flower and smiled, and that's said to mark the mind-to-mind transmission. That's something that we'll return to at the end of today's lecture. All right, so next, we'll talk a bit about the early transmission of Buddhism into China. Buddhism was transmitted to China from India, not as part of an invading army or cultural or any other form of imperialism. Rather, Buddhist monks followed trade routes and went through Central Asia and into East Asia and so on. The kind of founding myth of the transmission of Buddhism into China is around Emperor Ming's dream, which is in the 1st century CE. Emperor Ming supposedly has this dream of a golden flying man to the west, sends his advisors, and they bring back a Buddha statue. Now, one of the interesting observations scholars often make is that this initial, official initiation of the importation of Buddhism may not be when Buddhism was first imported, but rather may mark the point at which the government felt it had to now respond to this interesting force that is, this interesting tradition that's taking root in China. Buddhism had probably been trickling into what we now call China for a long time, perhaps by land, desert, or mountain, or sea. China's big, India and Central Asia are big as well. Initially, Buddhist communities seem to have been concentrated among the non-Chinese population, but eventually both commoners and elites are beginning to get interested in Buddhism. And I just want to draw your attention to these two monks here, the one on the right having somewhat more stereotypically East Asian features, and the one on the left, if you look closely, has blue eyes and red hair, right? Every now and again, they have found these mummies in the deserts of Western China that sometimes have red hair and green eyes and are 6 feet tall. Central Asia was a very diverse place, right? You had people from all over South Asia, all over Central Asia, and all over East Asia, traveling along these trade routes, and one of the things that was making its way around was Buddhism. So that's kind of interesting. By the post-Han period, so this is after the fall of the Han Dynasty. Han Dynasty is roughly 200 BCE to 200 CE. With the fall of the Han Dynasty, the way that I like to put it is that, society was kind of cracking. It's this period of cultural and political disunity, and in through the cracks flowed this thing that we now call Chinese Buddhism, or Buddhism that became Chinese. An important point to emphasize at the beginning is that, as we're talking about these different schools of thought or traditions or forms of practice, we're not talking about sects. We're not talking about schools. We're not talking about denominations in the way that we would think of them in English today, right? For example, I grew up, my father's family is Methodist, and my mother's family was Baptist, and those differences really mattered, right? my Baptist grandmother, for example, did not like the fact that I had a Methodist baptism, right? As a baby, because that's kind of against their theology. So in those cases, like those are denominational differences that really matter. Now, in the East Asian case, this stuff often overlaps. Okay, so you could be a Chan Buddhist who practices Pure Land, has an initiation into an esoteric lineage, studies the Avatamsaka Sutra or the Lotus Sutra. Yet you can kind of do all this stuff at once. So these are non-exclusivistic, right? So non-exclusive. These things often overlap. Sometimes a school of thought may be localized, associated with a particular place. In some cases, a school of thought may focus on a particular text or a doctrinal interpretation of a text. They include a lineage of teachers and disciples, master student kind of over time, or particular areas of specialty. Right. So one of the early areas of specialty for some of the Central Asian masters coming into China was spell master. Right. So you had people who specialized in spells. One of my favorite spell texts is called the Toothache Sutra. It's a sutra that has a spell that if you chant, it's supposed to cure your toothache. Right? So you would have people who specialized in that type of stuff, or philosophy, or meditation, or the monastic rules, or whatever. But let's not think of these as discrete, autonomous, separate institutions, but rather perhaps areas of study that you might course through in your life, right? So one of the reasons why people tend to misunderstand how this term works, so the Chinese character up here is zong, or shu in Japanese. After 1600 in Japan, this term shu comes to really mean like institutionally autonomous, distinct traditions. And Japanese scholarship really influenced how we study Chinese Buddhism. Furthermore, the European Christian context is also important. Many people have studied Chinese Buddhism from a Christian perspective. In fact, I believe the first book on Chinese Buddhism in English was written by a missionary, right? So coming from this Christian perspective, wherein being a Protestant or a Catholic or a Calvinist or a Lutheran, these denominational differences really, really matter, like a matter of life and death. All of these areas of study we're going to be talking about are much more fluid, much more diverse, and basically everything overlaps with everything somewhere. Right. So just kind of keep that in mind as we continue. Right. One of the first people I like to talk about is Tiantai Zhi. He's the great master of Tiantai, and a lineage eventually forms associated with this Tiantai mountain master. So Buddhism is beginning to flow into China from all these different places. Buddhism didn't come to China at one time or as one thing. Many different texts, many different systems and ideas. And people are trying to figure out how does it all fit together. If it's all the words of the Buddha, it must have some coherence somehow. So Zhi develops a comprehensive doctrinal system and a comprehensive meditation system. He focuses on the Lotus Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra and other things. I was especially interested in Madhyamaka philosophy, like the philosophy of so-called emptiness, as a basis for his tradition. And also incorporate certain Pure Land practices that end up becoming really important for other Buddhist countries, especially Japan, Korea, and elsewhere. In thinking about the philosophy of emptiness, the Madhyamaka philosophy, Zhi also contributes a new way of thinking about emptiness, right? Well, if you remember from our previous conversations on the concept of emptiness in Mahayana Buddhism, we have emptiness and then conventional reality. Right? Emptiness is the ultimate truth that all things are in fact composite, dependently arisen, fundamentally lacking in any kind of unchanging essence, right? In other words, everything is kind of always in a state of flow, dynamic change. The word emptiness in English can have kind of a negative connotation. So some people have even suggested translating the term shunyata in Sanskrit as openness, that all things are open, all things are kind of open to this dynamic change. But our conventional reality, we have our kind of fixed views. I'm like this, the world is like this. I experience, pain and suffering and frustration and all these other things. And both of those are a kind of reality. Zhi's vision of the three truths suggests that there's kind of a middle position from which you can engage both of these at the same time, to see the big picture, that all things are in a state of change, but also recognize the particular experience of individual beings, like there's a kind of a microcosm, macrocosm relationship going on there. One of his great texts, the Moha Jirguan, proposes a fourfold samadhi, kind of a fourfold approach to meditation. One is a 90-day period of constant sitting, a 90-day period of constant walking, a 90-day period of both sitting and walking, and a 90-day period of neither sitting nor walking. The constant walking practice becomes really important in later Japanese Buddhism, kind of the hall of constant practice, as it becomes closely associated with the chanting of the name of Amitabha. One of the ways that this is sometimes explained is that through this practice, your sense of self and your sense of separateness from Buddha over here and my ordinary self over here, eventually those kind of blur together, or those perceived boundaries begin to break down. And you see that Buddha reality and ordinary reality, emptiness and conventional reality are ultimately one and the same. One of the techniques used to remain focused during meditation is the recitation of the name of the Buddha Amitabha. So, Namo Amitofo, Namo Amitofo, or in Japanese, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. As this lineage kind of influences the whole of East Asian Buddhism, this particular practice kind of goes off and becomes really powerful and important as well. So Zhi, he's not the first person to come up with this comprehensive view of Buddhist, philosophy and meditation, but he's one of the really effective ones, and his disciples go on to, profoundly impact all of, the East Asian tradition. Another important, an important text that Zhi incorporates into his system is the Avatamsaka Sutra, and he suggests that the Buddha's early experience of ultimate reality is contained within the Avatamsaka Sutra. So he lists it first, and then suggests that the other teachings are there kind of simplifying and expounding what the Buddha meant, or to kind of provide a complete picture in terms that people can understand. Later Chinese thinkers would say, well, if this is the first teaching, then it must be the best, right? So for Zhi, the Lotus Sutra and the Huayan Sutra, which he regards as the final teachings, he said that those are the perfect teachings, whereas others kind of looked at it from the other direction. At the first teaching, the Avatamsaka Sutra, that should be understood to be the ultimate teaching of the Buddha. So the Chinese Huayan system, so that's how you pronounce the phrase, the Avatamsaka Sutra is a Huayan Jing in Chinese. A distinct school of philosophy develops around this sutra that kind of explores the interconnectedness of all things. One of the common metaphors or symbols used to explain and expound the meanings of the Avatamsaka Sutra is the jeweled net of Indra. It's this idea that the god Indra casts his net throughout the universe, and at the node of each net there's a jewel, and if you were to grab the jewel and look at it, you would see that each jewel reflects every other jewel. And this is kind of conveying this idea that everything is interconnected with every other thing, that nothing exists independently. We're all in this kind of interconnected cosmos, and that includes this world and the Pure Land, our limited self and the Buddha, and so on. One of the important systematizers of the Huayan system is the monk Fazan. Okay, let's go check out some more stuff. One of the other really important people in East Asian history is Xuanzang. I believe there's a book series called Lives of the Great Masters, I believe published by Shambhala. One of my former professors from University of Michigan, Ben Brosey, wrote a book on this guy, Xuanzang, and I can't wait to check it out. So highly recommend that. Xuanzang decided that he wanted to travel to India to collect more texts, to kind of update Chinese Buddhism. But the emperor said no, but he goes anyway. And this heroic journey through Central and South Asia is the basis for the story of the Monkey King and Tripitaka that we may know from Journey to the West. If you haven't checked out the Journey to the West, definitely check out. There's a lot of great anime and video games and other great stories about Journey to the West. But that's kind of loosely based on the daring journey of Xuanzang to go update these texts. So he becomes a scholar of the Yogacara philosophy. and translates all of these great texts and brings them back with him. This is him with his, him picture with his big backpack, I guess. Um, Yogacara is complex and nuanced, and perhaps we could do a day just on that at some point in the future. But you could think of Yogacara as a kind of early Buddhist psychology. How does our experience and our perception condition and transform our reality? How does our perception of reality and our engagement with reality affect our karma, and how does karmic continuity work? If the self is in this state of constant change, how is it that karma follows us lifetime to lifetime? These are some of the questions that the Yogacara system is developing, or the Yogacara system is working on, and the Chinese system that develops out of it is known as Faxiang. Faxiang, or Hoso in Japanese, again goes on to influence all of Japanese Buddhism, all of East Asian Buddhism, and in Japan there are some important debates between Tendai thinkers and Hoso thinkers, or Tiantai and Faxiang thinkers, about Buddha nature, about the capacity for all beings to achieve awakening, and so on. So there's a little bit on this particular area of inquiry. Next, we have Pure Land practices. So I've already mentioned the idea that the recitation of the name of Amitabha is part of the Tiantai system, but it's also it's part of Mahayana Buddhism in general, and that's one of the key points I was trying to convey in the other lectures on the Pure Land tradition, is that aspiration for rebirth in the Pure Land, the goal of attaining a vision of the Buddha Amitabha, these are things that we just see in a lot of different Mahayana traditions. And the specific practice of contemplating the Buddha or reciting the name of the Buddha is something that we see in many different Buddhist traditions, whether it's Chan or Tiantai or whatever. So one of the other key terms here is Buddha Nusmriti. Buddha Nusmriti essentially means Buddha mindfulness. Smriti is the Sanskrit for the term sati that some people may know, meaning mindfulness. And again, it comes to have two connotations, one being the contemplation of the Buddha, others being the chanting of the name of the Buddha. And there are many great Pure Land teachers who help to systematize this approach to Buddhism. One of the great teachers in particular is Shan Dao, who argues that even ordinary beings, through relying upon the Buddha, relying upon the chanting of the name, even ordinary beings can attain the state of non-retrogression. That means you can get to a point where you're not going to backslide, where you will only continue to make progress on the path. For some Buddhists, the Pure Land is a real place, a goal that you aspire to be reborn in after you die. For many other Buddhists, it is also understood as a state of mind, the mind in its true form, the Buddha Amitabha being a symbol for your own Buddha nature, and so on. Here we have pictured a cave painting depicting the Pure Land with these kind of Chinese-style pavilions. There's also some interesting Central Asian artistic elements here. And you can imagine these beautiful paintings as like immersive environments where you are kind of training your mind to see the Pure Land right here and now. And imagine going into one of these caves, lit by candlelight, and and just this kind of shimmering image that starts to take on a certain kind of reality. And I think that's perhaps one of the ways we could think about the Pure Land within East Asian Buddhism. To further kind of expand on this, we see the Pure Lands from many different perspectives and within each of these different traditions. So the great philosophical systems like Prajnaparamita or Madhyamaka, the kind of philosophies of emptiness, may emphasize the two truths. We have the Pure Land on the one hand, we have this world on the other hand, but ultimately they're one and the same. Ultimately, it's all emptiness. Yeah. This is further kind of explored within the Tiantai system with the three truths. We have Buddha reality, ordinary reality, and the position from which you can experience both at the same time. With Huayan, there's the teaching of interpenetration, that the microcosm and macrocosm, each individual thing is interconnected. So the Buddha Amitabha may seem far away, but is in fact ultimately interconnected with oneself and one's present reality. There are a lot of interesting esoteric systems and traditions, whether we're talking about Dharani or mantra or spells, or later esoteric systems that encourage the contemplation of the Buddha Amitabha or contemplation of the Pure Land. Some of the stuff that I work on is people using spells or mantras to get to the Pure Land, to get even better spells or mantras, or people who are kind of using these things to get to the Pure Land. So we also see this within some of the esoteric systems. And then, Chan Buddhism is one of these traditions that kind of forms and kind of comprehensively engages the diversity of the Chinese Buddhist world. And that includes using, the chanting of the name of Amitabha and other Pure Land practices. And there's this later practice, that says, who is it that chants the name of the Buddha? Is it I? Is it someone else? And so on. Is it Buddha? Is it I? Ultimately, these are one and the same. So that's one way that Chan Buddhists may engage with this approach to Buddhism as well. To go into a little bit more detail on these so-called esoteric systems, by the 9th century and so on, the kind of at the pinnacle of the Chinese Buddhist world, you have these new Indian esoteric tantric systems beginning to flourish. One of the great teachers associated with this tradition, Amoghavajra, a recent book has argued that we could really see Amoghavajra as the founder of what we now think of as esoteric Buddhism in East Asia. So it's drawing upon ritual texts known as tantras that kind of systematize the use of mudras, so coded hand movements to kind of symbolize the body of the Buddha, recitation of mantras to symbolize the speech of the Buddha, and the contemplation of Buddha images and geometrically arranged mandalas, like the womb realm mandala pictured here, kind of bringing together body, speech, and mind, a recognition that ordinary beings and Buddhas are not really separate from one another. This is sometimes called the three mysteries. Body, speech, and mind are our three sources of karmic production. And what that basically means is those are the three ways we tend to get ourselves in trouble, okay? But this Buddha here in the center, Mahavarochana, is said to be kind of the sum total of all things, right? This is like the cosmic Buddha, or the cosmos as Buddha. This mandala here, in a sense, depicts the universe, reality in its compassionate, quiescent state. From this perspective, we don't know this, but in fact, if you're initiated and have a teacher-disciple relationship where they reveal this to you through these practices, all forms and all bodies are actually the body of the cosmic Buddha. All sound, all speech is the speech of the cosmic Buddha, and all conception, all minds are the mind of the cosmic Buddha. And through these practices, you realize that that is in fact the case. And in that ritual context, you attain what's called Buddhahood in this very body, where it's not just that you do the ritual to become a Buddha, but you do the ritual to realize you already are participating in this thing called awakening, right? One of the kind of foundational Mahayana ideas that we see expressed within this tradition, certain Pure Land traditions, Zen, and so on, this idea that awakening is not this distant goal that we have to attain, but rather awakening is, so you think of, awakening as a goal, awakening as a noun, but you also think of awakening as a verb, an ongoing process that we are participating in, okay? So one of the fun things about esoteric Buddhism is there's a lot of beautiful art associated with it as well. And then here we have one other way of thinking about Buddhism, and that's kind of focused on lineage, right? So we've talked about doctrinal systems, for example, Yogacara or Madhyamaka. We also have systems that are kind of focused on texts, right? We could see Tiantai is kind of focused on the Lotus Sutra, perhaps, or Huayan is focused on the Avatamsaka Sutra. We have traditions maybe focused on a particular place, right? So Tiantai is the name of a mountain range where Zhi lived. So you could think of that as associated with a particular place. With esoteric Buddhism and Chan, which we'll talk about now, there's also a strong emphasis on lineage. My teacher's teacher's teacher was the Buddha himself, right? Within the context of esoteric Buddhism, the Buddha to which the lineage is connected is like the universe, the cosmic Buddha. Whereas when it comes to Chan, it's Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay. Chan Buddhism, sometimes called the meditation school, and Chan does kind of refer to that. But Chan is also sometimes referred to as Fo Xin Zong, or in Chinese, or Bushin Shu in Japanese, the Buddha mind school. There are some later debates in Korean Zen or Son, where a monk says, I think it's a Hyojong, who says, you guys might be focused on the Buddha's words, studying the doctrine, learning your books, but we're focused on the Buddha's mind, right? So that's an important distinction there. Yeah. This is perhaps similar to the way that esoteric Buddhists may distinguish between the exoteric teachings, the explicit, revealed teachings, and then the esoteric teaching, the secret or hidden teaching, right? So Chan and the esoteric traditions make some interesting similar moves, and indeed you do have people who are well versed in both. Okay? The Chan tradition, as I mentioned previously, is said to derive from this mythic flower sermon. The Buddha holds up a sermon and then gives a kind of silent transmission. There's one student, Mahakashapa, who gets it. Mahakashapa is then the first patriarch of the Chan lineage. 28 generations later, we get to this Indian monk, Bodhidharma, pictured here. I like this picture because he looks so friendly. Most of them, he's got this, a big beard, frowny face, big crazy eyes. Here he just looks so nice. I just like that. Anyway, so Bodhidharma may or may not have been a historical individual. He may be kind of an archetype for a certain type of perhaps iconoclastic meditation monk that's coming in from India. Figures like this were known by Zhi, who seems to have not had the highest opinion of these types of meditation masters, which he felt were kind of overly focused on meditation, whereas the critique that we see coming from Chan towards let's say Tiantai or other traditions is you guys are focused too much on the doctrine and not enough on the practice. So there's this kind of constant striving for balance. Eventually, once we get to the Song Dynasty, later Chinese history, Chan Buddhism, the claim to being the lineage of the Buddha's mind, the claim to being the ultimate teaching, seems to win. And in order to, anybody who's somebody is going to get their Chan lineage affiliation. I want to give you this beautiful verse. So Chan is often called the teaching outside the scripture, and we have this very famous verse: a special transmission outside the scripture, do not establish or do not rely upon words and letters, directly point to the human mind, see one's nature, and become Buddha. I just like this phrase. So directly pointing to the human mind, see your nature, and become Buddha. So it's this idea that Chan is beyond words, or it is the that which will put you in touch with that which is beyond words. Yeah. One of the great things about East Asian Buddhism, though, okay, so East Asian culture in general is highly literate, right? Lots of writing, lots of government bureaucracy. I mean that in a positive sense. People are writing a lot of documents, right? People are writing a lot of poetry and essays and literature and philosophy and so on. So East Asia in general, highly literate culture. Some of the most prolific writers in this highly literate culture are Chan Buddhists. The people, within the teaching outside the scripture, spend an awful lot of time writing about it. I think that's really interesting and kind of awesome, actually. Chan ends up becoming really important. But once again, it's not as if these different areas of study are separate from one another, but rather they all kind of overlap with one another and kind of work together to construct the rich tapestry that is Chinese Buddhism. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and see if we have any questions or thoughts. So thank you so much.